Democracy Denied: How Obama is Ignoring You and Bypassing Congress. Never mind Doug Lamborn and the rest of the U.S. House. Never mind Tom Coburn and the rest of the U.S. Senate. How Obama is ignoring you and bypassing Congress to radically transform America. We've seen it repeatedly of late, have we not? We saw it very recently just with his unilateral effort to enact an amnesty and part of the DREAM Act. To radically transform America and how to stop him. Phil Kerpen is the author. Phil is president of a group called American Commitment, which works on restoring and protecting America's core commitment to free markets, economic growth, constitutional limited government, property rights, and individual freedom. His work history in Washington, D.C. reads like a who's who of organizations out there on the front lines fighting to protect our freedom and restore our Constitution. Phil has worked with such organizations as Americans for Prosperity, the Free Enterprise Fund, Club for Growth, and Cato Institute. Democracy will be denied, he warns us, unless we do our part and stop the train. Please welcome now Phil Kerpen.
Wake you up before the speech.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
Can democracy be denied? One book dares to tell the truth.
They will use Chicago-style shakedown politics to get anything and everything they want.
America rejected Obama's liberal agenda.
Republicans have won control of the House of Representatives.
But he won't let that stop him.
Until Nancy Pelosi's speaker again, I'd like to work my way around Congress. I will take a backseat to no one. I'll spend my entire adult life working with SEIU. I'm not a newcomer to this.
Cap and trade was just one way of skinning the cat. It was not the only way. It was a means, not an end.
His promises of transparency proved empty.
These negotiations will be on C-SPAN.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
The almost complete breakdown of the rule of law in this country. We've got czars running every aspect of our lives, every aspect of the government.
I'd like to work my way around Congress.
We need to investigate this administration. We need to hold them accountable. We need to block all their czars, and we need to block all their regulatory power grabs and Chicago shakedown politics, and it starts here today.
The truth will be revealed. Democracy denied. Own it today and take action.
All right, well, John asked me to wake you up before my talk, so I hope that helped a little bit. We are facing truly a lawless administration. There's almost no other way to describe it. I think the tone was set very early in the Obama administration with the auto bankruptcies, and with particular the way the Chrysler bondholders were treated, where they were basically told, we'll throw 200 years of bankruptcy law out the window. You'll take our deal, which is pennies on the dollar, even though you're senior secured creditors, and the unions will be made whole, and if you don't take the deal, we'll destroy your life any way we can. And they took the deal, and it set the tone. And since then, I think we've seen an administration that's made clear that they will get their way without respect to what the American people want, as we saw so clearly, for instance, with the health care law, without respect to what the Congress has done, and we saw many of their legislative priorities outright rejected by the people's elected representatives in Congress. Cap and trade went down in flames. Card check went down in flames. They're moving forward all the same. And we've seen a president who, when he doesn't like the law, just says, I won't enforce it. I don't care. Defense of Marriage Act, won't defend it in court. The country's immigration laws, we don't need to enforce those. I don't like them. We'll just do an amnesty by the back door. And so what we face right now is genuinely the breakdown of the rule of law, the loss of sort of the most basic element of our system, which is if you want to change it, if you want to change the rules, if you want to change the laws, you pass it through Congress. You get a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and you sign it into law. That's the way it's supposed to work. In fact, the founders thought this such a critically important principle that the very first thing they wrote in the Constitution after the famous We the People preamble was Article 1, Section 1, which said all legislative power herein granted is vested in a Congress composed of a House and a Senate. You'll note that the founders did not say that the power is all vested in the czars and the EPA bureaucrats and the IRS and the HHS and the FDA and the DHS and all the other alphabet soup federal agencies that you never heard of or that, unfortunately, you have to deal with every day. But that's the situation that we're in right now in this country, and this administration is using all of that apparatus to the maximum extent possible to affect the fundamental transformation of America as the president promised that he would. Now, Milton Friedman famously said that if you pick any 3 letters in the English alphabet, it's a federal bureaucracy we'd be better off without. I don't think that's ever been more true than right now at the present time. And we could step through some of the things that are in the video and that I talked about in the book, because I think this is absolutely crucial. Cap and trade. This was the plan that the president said in 2008 would make your electricity bill necessarily skyrocket. Oh, and by the way, if someone wants to build a coal plant, they can, but it'll bankrupt them. This was his bill to make us all poor by doubling or tripling or quadrupling our electric bills and the price we pay at the pump for gasoline. That one has actually doubled, by the way. And it crashed and burned. Nancy Pelosi forced it through the House, 217 to 212, nearly a party line vote. Senate refused to even touch it. They understood politically that this thing was a total disaster. And this was probably the single best issue, well, maybe second to health care, but one of the biggest issues in the 2010 landslide election. The 2010 election, by the way, it's easy to forget because absolutely nothing has changed in the country since, but the 2010 election was one of the biggest landslide elections in all of history. 67 House seats changed hands, 7 U.S. Senate seats, 21 state legislative chambers all over the country, all demanding less government, less taxes, less spending, less intrusion in our lives. Cap and trade was a huge part of that. Probably about 24 Democrats lost their House seats almost entirely because of their vote for cap and trade. One gentleman who's now a United States Senator named Joe Manchin literally shot a bullet through the bill in a TV ad called Dead Aim. It was one of my favorite political ads of all time because he showed us he liked guns and he hated the cap and trade law, and that got him elected to the U.S. Senate from West Virginia. And the very next day, literally the day after the election, where all of these Democrats had lost because of cap and trade, the president was asked at a press conference, what happens now on your cap and trade bill? And he said, oh, that was only one way of skinning the cat. That was just a means to an end. I have other ways to accomplish the same end. Now, the end, of course, is the end of affordable energy. It's him making our electric prices skyrocket, doubling or tripling the price of gasoline, and so on. He said, I have other means to the same end. Then he went on for a couple of minutes about how, the EPA can do this under existing legislative authority and we'll just twist and rewrite 40-year-old environmental laws to pretend they were about global warming and we'll make electricity prices skyrocket that way. And he has. You're going to be looking at dramatic increases in the price of electricity over the next 2 or 3 years. Most of the country will be going up 20 or 30%. And that's just from the first round of these rules, things like the Utility Act rule about mercury. Now, mercury is nasty stuff. I wouldn't recommend that you breathe it or touch it or eat it, but mercury in the air is at extraordinarily safe levels, and 0.5% of the mercury in the air comes from coal-fired power plants, 0.5%. The Obama administration, however, has said, well, there's some studies that say that certain Pacific Islanders that eat nothing but fish year-round, subsistence fishermen, if they're pregnant, then the baby of a pregnant woman who eats 300 pounds of contaminated fish a year might lose 1 or 2 IQ points. This is the only time in history Democrats seem to care about unborn babies, so it's an interesting, maybe a breakthrough in that regard. But apparently, because of this hypothetical population of subsistence pregnant fisherwomen that the EPA models to exist but cannot prove exist, they're going to raise the price of electricity 10 to 20% for everyone in this country. And it's going to get much worse from there when they follow it up with their greenhouse gas regulations, which are going to effectively shut down most of the coal plants in this country, conveniently scheduled to go final just after this next presidential election. And it's not just the EPA regulations driving the price of electricity up. We've seen something very similar on petroleum. And that's one of the reasons that we've seen the price at the pump double since Obama came into office. Does anyone remember what the price was, by the way, when Obama came into office? It was $1.83 a gallon. Does that sound good right now, $1.83 a gallon? The Obama administration said that they were for offshore drilling because they had to on the campaign trail. 2008, the price of gasoline was about $4 in August of that summer. The people went crazy. I think of that as sort of the proto-Tea Party, the protest that we had that summer with the Don't Go movement and things like that. Obama said, oh, of course I'm for offshore drilling. President Bush lifted the presidential ban on offshore drilling. Nancy Pelosi caved and lifted the congressional ban on offshore drilling, which a lot of people forget, as of October 1st, 2008. And in the next 3 months after that, the price of gasoline plummeted from $4 to $1.83. Why? Because markets are forward-looking. They believed we're finally going to produce in these vast resources we have offshore the United States. They said that's got to mean prices are going to come down. The speculative bubble crashed, and prices came down dramatically. Obama came in. He got a very tragic but very convenient for him excuse with the Gulf oil spill. And he said, I'm going to impose a moratorium, not just on the areas where the old moratorium was that were lifted off the coasts, but I'm going to impose a new illegal moratorium in the Gulf of Mexico as well. And I say illegal because Ken Salazar, the Secretary of the Interior, was literally held in contempt of court in the Fifth Circuit because that moratorium was illegal. It was based on a report that was doctored by White House political staff led by Carol Browner. By the way, until she went into the White House, she was on the board of the Socialist International Commission on a Sustainable World Society. But of course, no one in this administration is a socialist. Carol Browner doctored a report from experts who said, we recommend against a moratorium. She changed it to say we recommend a moratorium, and the Interior Department shut down deepwater production in the Gulf, dramatically slowed down permitting on shallow water construction. 9 deepwater rigs left the Gulf permanently for places like Brazil and Egypt. Even now, permitting has not returned to normal levels. And I don't know if you noticed this, because I almost missed it, but on Thursday, the day that the Supreme Court handed down what I think will go down as one of the most infamous decisions in its history, the Interior Department quietly announced a brand new offshore drilling moratorium that no one in the public or the media was paying attention to because we were distracted with other things that were going on. So that's his cap and trade agenda. It's moved forward just the same as if it had actually passed, even though the American people rejected it. Same thing with the union agenda. You remember the card check bill that actually took away the private ballot for union organizing elections so that union organizers could come to your house, say, you really want to sign this card and join the union, don't you? Or they could harass you in the workplace. They could use all sorts of intimidation tactics. By the way, under the Hobbs Act, union organizers can actually use violence. They have an exemption in federal law as long as the violence is advancing, quote, a legitimate union purpose. Okay? Almost all the Democrats support this. It had a majority of the House in the last Congress supporting it, although they were smart enough not to vote on it. They'd voted on it the previous Congress, embarrassingly for them, but they pushed awfully hard for this. The only Republican supporter they had was Arlen Specter, and he wasn't a Republican for very long. But they gave up on this when the public found out about it. The public found out about it. 80% plus of Americans think you ought to have a private ballot if you're voting on a union, which makes sense because the union can decide every aspect of your wages, your hours, your working conditions. They become your exclusive bargaining agent, so people wanted a private ballot for that. Now, before they gave up on card check, they had one last-ditch attempt to save the bill. And Tom Harkin, who's the chairman of that committee, the HELP committee, said, what if instead of getting rid of elections completely and letting them just come to your, harass you openly, sign the cards, what if we have elections, but we have them on such a short timetable that employers can't make the case on why a worker might not want to join the union, workers can't be educated, and the union organizers can pick the timing to maximize their advantage. So we can snap these surprise elections in as little as a week. They can time it for their maximum advantage. And that failed also. That did not get any traction. That failed in the House, and that failed in the Senate. And now, illegally, in my view, it's the law of the land, thanks to the National Labor Relations Board, that made it up by reinterpreting the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. Made it up. Made it up with a recess-appointed gentleman named Craig Becker at the helm, who was nominated by the president specifically to advance the idea of rewriting the union laws to favor unions without going through Congress. He had written at length on this, a 50,000-word law review on how they could gut all of the protections for employers. He actually wrote, employers should be stripped of any legally recognizable rights with respect to union organizing. That's pretty close to an exact quote. Obama nominated him. He was rejected. Bipartisan vote rejected in the Senate. Obama recess appointed him anyway, and he installed the ambush election rule that is now in effect. It has taken effect, and unions can now ambush and surprise employers, force people into unions without really understanding what's at stake and what's going on. Similarly, we now have, for the first time in history, an FCC that asserts for itself the power to regulate the internet. You may have missed Congress passing this legislation. It's because it never did. The FCC created this out of whole cloth on a 3-2 party line vote about a month after the 2010 election. All three of these things have something in common. The cap and trade agenda advancing, the card check agenda, the FCC deciding to regulate the internet. They've all happened because the Democrats in the Senate refuse to do their job and stand up to abuses of power in this administration, because we have had votes in the US Senate on overturning all of these abuses, and almost every Democrat has voted against standing up to this administration almost every single time. And so with the complicity of the legislative branch, Congress has become irrelevant. They've made themselves irrelevant. They have voted to allow essentially unlimited powers to the president, and I would suggest that if a man rules by dictate, as this man does, the dictates of his bureaucrats and his regulators and his own dictates with executive orders such as his amnesty executive order, is there not a word in the English language for a man who rules by dictate? And I won't say it because it's impolite, but is that not precisely what's occurring right now, what's going on in this country? And Congress, the people that we elect to represent us, is standing by and allowing it to happen. They are being deliberately complicit with the destruction of our system of representative government and its replacement by a system in which one man and the various bureaucrats and regulators beneath him can rule by dictate. There's an elegant and powerful legislative solution to this fundamental structural problem. It's been advanced by Representative Jeff Davis in the House of Representatives. It's called the REINS Act, the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act. It passed the House 241 to 194 late last year. Surprisingly or not, we've not been able to get a vote on it in the Senate. But think about this idea and tell me how common sense this is. This bill says, for any economically significant regulations, the big ones that matter, that have an impact on the economy and on our lives, instead of the bureaucrats and regulators being able to have their way with us and trying to get Congress to muster the will to stand up to them, they would simply recommend to Congress, and Congress would vote up or down. And these regulations would only take effect if our elected representatives in Congress voted to approve them. Does that make sense? This idea didn't come from an expert. Didn't come from a Washington think tank or a university or any of the high-minded elites that we're supposedly supposed to defer to. This idea came from a remarkable man, a 78-year-old Tea Party activist from Alexandria, Kentucky, in northern Kentucky, a suburb of Cincinnati, a man named Lloyd Rogers, a wounded Navy veteran, worked about 30 years as an engineer for Cincinnati Bell, and then late in life he got involved in politics, self-taught. Told me he started reading about the Constitution, taking classes in public speaking, and one day he handed his congressman a piece of paper, and it said, Article 1, Section 1, United States Constitution, all legislative power herein granted is vested in a Congress. And he said, Congressman, how is it the EPA can double and triple my water bill with this stormwater management consent decree? Which, by the way, the stormwater management consent decree, just for 3 counties in northern Kentucky, cost $1 billion, billion with a B. And so he said, hey, shouldn't you have to vote on this? Shouldn't there be a vote? I elected you. Shouldn't there be a vote before $1 billion of cost can be imposed on us? And that's where this bill came from. And I'll tell you this, I know some of you may not have read all 57 points in Mitt Romney's economic plan, but the REINS Act is in there. He's promised to sign it as president, and I think that would be a tremendous step towards forcing accountability and forcing our elected officials to make the decisions that matter. Now, unfortunately, when Congress was actually doing stuff, when Pelosi and Reid were in charge, they were doing the wrong things. And they were vastly expanding the power of regulators and bureaucrats over our lives. And the 2 pieces of legislation that they passed are some of the worst examples in history of passing broad, vague legislation that leaves all the real power up to the bureaucrats to figure it out and take over. And that's true of the president's health care law, and it's also true of Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank, which was mentioned by a questioner, calls for over 500 rulemakings. The thing's over 1,000 pages long, but it's less a law than just a grant of authority to the bureaucrats to write 500 separate laws. And all of these bureaucracies are going wild now, writing all of these rules, and their only incentive, as Senator Coburn correctly pointed out, their only incentive is not to get in trouble as regulators, not to allow anything to go wrong. If they stop you from taking a risk, if they stop you from making a loan, well, there's no risk in that for them. The only risk is if the loan happens and it doesn't go well. And I think that's one of the reasons the housing recovery has been so terrible in this country, because every bank, every mortgage lender has got a federal bureaucrat standing over their shoulder saying, don't you dare unless you're 100% sure that this loan will never go bad. And there's no such thing as that in a free market economy. So that's been a disaster. By the way, the woman that Obama put in charge of implementing the bill, he did his usual end run around Congress for a woman named Elizabeth Warren, most famous now as a fake Indian. She's running for the Senate up in Massachusetts. Remarkably entertaining race up there, but it's Massachusetts, so who knows, they might vote for her. Chris Dodd said, no, she can't run it because she's too radical. Chris Dodd said she's too radical. By the way, think about how crazy it is for Barney Frank and Chris Dodd to be the ones put in charge of fixing the financial system. Right? I mean, Barney Frank, after the entire housing market had imploded, Barney Frank went on TV and said, Fannie Mae's fine. Nothing to see there. It's fine. And then he was in charge of writing the bill to fix our financial system. This is how Washington works. It's kind of astonishing, isn't it? It's like, let's find the worst culprits and then put them in charge of fixing the problem. I mean, Chris Dodd now is the top lobbyist for the Motion Picture Association of America, so he was the one trying to destroy the internet in the name of Hollywood more recently. But this bill is just a vast grant of authority. He put Elizabeth Warren in charge of implementing it as a White House czar because he couldn't get her confirmed by the Senate. She got all of the structure in place. And then he put someone else in charge, a man named Richard Cordray. But he put him in charge by declaring the Senate to be in recess when they believed themselves to be in session. He said, I know you think you're in session. And I know that for the last year and a half that President Bush was in power, the Senate refused to go in recess to block recess appointments, and he respected that. But even though you think you're in session, I'm declaring the Senate to be in recess because I've got to install Richard Cordray so that the so-called Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the worst designed, most powerful bureaucracy yet, can get on with regulating just about any financial transaction anywhere in the economy, and just to make sure that the CFPB would have the least amount of accountability possible. In the Dodd-Frank law, they said that it's not subject to oversight from Congress in the appropriations process. Instead, it's funded directly out of the Federal Reserve. You just print their own money. Go regulate. You have as much money as you need. You're inside the Federal Reserve. You never have to come to Congress for any funding. By the way, the same day that he did that, declared the Senate to be in recess when they believed themselves not to be for Richard Cordray, he put two union radicals on the NLRB by the same mechanism to make sure they could continue with these ridiculous pro-union rulemakings like they did with ambush elections, including one of them, Richard Griffin, who came directly from being the general counsel of the International Union of Operating Engineers. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this union, but it's pretty much the most corrupt union out there, more or less an arm of the mob. He's now on the National Labor Relations Board writing more pro-union rules because Obama decided he can declare a recess regardless of whether the Senate believes itself to be in recess. Which brings us to the worst of everything that's happened under this president, because the rest of it was minor compared to this, which is the president's health care law. And I think in our pain and anger at what the Supreme Court did and at who John Roberts revealed himself to be, it's easy to lose sight of all of the reasons that we hated this law so much in the first place and that the American people objected to it. The hundreds of new boards, agencies, and bureaucracies that stand between patients and doctors that have the power to decide who lives and who dies, the astonishing taxes, the costs, the fact that it makes healthcare more expensive rather than less, and they went ahead and passed it anyway, and what it does to Medicare, which I think is absolutely criminal. And I would suggest that as conservatives, we should not hesitate to criticize what this bill does to Medicare, because it's easy to, people, they get anxious. They say, well, I'm for cutting spending. This thing eviscerates Medicare, $500 billion at least. So, cuts in spending are good. I should be for this. You cannot fix a program by refusing to pay hospitals and doctors, and that's what Obamacare does. It says we're not going to pay a reasonable rate of reimbursement. And that means people will not get access to care. Seniors who paid in their entire life, who paid into a system, it's not their fault that Congress stole that money and wasted it on unrelated federal spending. It is not the fault of seniors that happened. Medicare is in a disastrous financial condition. That's true, we all know that. But you have to fix it the right way with fundamental reforms like the Ryan budget that empower individuals to control their Medicare dollars, bring market competition in, allow people to get the care they need in a more effective, more efficient way where they control their own health care. And we don't say tough for all the money you've been putting in all those years. And we should not back down from that message. I think it's critical. But we should also remember that the president's health care law was the original example of everything he's done by abusing the process to do things that Congress and the American people already rejected. Because this bill was not a finished piece of legislation. This was a discussion draft. This thing amends itself all over the place. It's got ambiguities, contradictions. It's a joke that they put this in the United States Code. And that happened because of Scott Brown's election. That happened because the people of Massachusetts, one of the most liberal states in the country, rejected this law. And Democrats in the Senate and in the House, they said, well, we got this previous discussion draft that was passed last Christmas. It was supposed to go into further negotiations, be finished. We're going to get a final bill and we'd pass that. But we can't do that now because of the people of Massachusetts. So let's contrive to go around them, to make them irrelevant, and take what was an unfinished discussion draft and insert it into the U.S. Code as is. And that, on top of all of the other reasons, is why this thing has to be repealed, because it has no business being in the U.S. Code in the first place. It's not even a finished law. And that has enormous practical consequences for what I was talking about earlier, because when you have something that contradicts itself all over the place, and has ambiguities and contradictions and all these things, all these glitches, you get the bureaucrats taking over. And now we've got HHS and IRS and all the rest of them saying, even though it says this, really it meant something totally different. Really it meant something else entirely. And if you don't comply with that, we'll find some other way to ruin your life. And we saw this very early after the law passed. Secretary Sebelius, by the way, Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, before she was governor of Kansas, was the executive director of the Kansas Trial Lawyers Association. So Obama put her in charge of tort reform. So it's shocking that hasn't gone anywhere. I don't know. Don't know why that died such a quiet death. But Kathleen Sebelius wrote a letter to the insurance company saying, even though the law doesn't say you must cover pre-existing conditions immediately for children, you're required to do that. And you guys, come on, you know what we meant, so you better do it or else. And that's how they're governing now with this law. The worst example of this is the IRS exchange rule. And I know that, I think it's very unfortunate, I know that Colorado passed your own Obama health care exchange law. I think that was a huge mistake. I would urge you to repeal it. And by the way, if you don't repeal it, if we actually win the federal fight and repeal that one, you're still going to have it here in Colorado. So think about that. But the IRS is saying, in the actual Obama health care law, it clearly says that the exchange subsidies, which are the new health care subsidies, the new Obamacare entitlement, the exchange subsidies and the $3,000 per employee penalty for employers only apply in states that have adopted a state-based exchange. The language does not say anywhere that in states where the federal government runs an exchange, the penalties apply and the subsidies are available. But the IRS has issued a guidance document saying that they are. They just made it up out of whole cloth. They said, we're going to let the subsidies flow. There's going to be a vote soon in the House and in the Senate. There's a procedure we can use called the Congressional Review Act to force that vote. There will be a vote this year before the election on overturning that rule. And I think this is going to be another great marker to put down to find out where these Senate Democrats stand. Do they believe the IRS, of all people, should be allowed to rewrite laws and tax whoever they want, whether it's in the statute or not? I think that would be an extraordinarily frightening precedent if they don't overturn that rule. So that's a vote to really watch and put pressure on. And I see John here, so I guess I'm running. I've got 5 minutes. All right, so we can cover a couple more things. The health care law can be defeated very simply We need a majority in the Senate, and we need the presidency. It's exactly that simple. That'll do it. And for those who say we need 60, that's wrong. About 95% of this law can be repealed under budget reconciliation with 51 votes. It could be 50 plus the tiebreaker vice president. The outcome of the Senate races looks extraordinarily close right now. The control of the Senate hangs in the balance, so do not take that for granted. We've got to be active in the Senate races. We've got to be educating people, even if they might have a Republican candidate they don't much like. I assure you they're going to vote to repeal Obamacare, and that's enough of a reason that people ought to be out there working to support them, because the balance of the Senate hangs on any single race right now. It really is going to be that close. And I think really the message of the Supreme Court this week, which was deeply painful to me, and I think to many of you as well. And I was out front of the Supreme Court on Thursday on the steps, and I was the idiot who saw the CNN Twitter and told everyone there that we won, and everyone went wild. And then I said, actually, no, we lost. So that was kind of the takeaway from it, and this is tragic, is that there's no area of our lives that's now safe from politics. We no longer have meaningful constitutional protections for individual freedoms or limitations on the power of government. That's frightening, and it's tragic. But if everything is politics, and if politicians wield unlimited power unchecked by our Constitution, then the solution is to work even harder in politics and make sure that the people who win and who have that unlimited power are our people who will choose not to use it, or perhaps will choose to restore those checks that we've lost. And I think it's more critical than ever for that reason that we work even harder and get even more engaged to make sure that this election cycle of all election cycles is one that we win. Because this inflection point that we're at now in our history, one where we cannot count on any external checks on what happens in the democratic process, makes it more critical than ever that we triumph in the democratic process. And fortunately, there are more of us than there are of them. If we work hard, we will win. We will win all of these races because there are more of us than there are of them. So I urge you to do everything you possibly can to win these races, to ensure that we're in a position where we can stand up to this administration, if God forbid it is reelected with a majority in the Senate, or much better than that, where we can be in a position to control the White House as well and be able to undo all of these egregious abuses of executive power and sort of restore the balance to the way that it's supposed to be in our system. I think that's possible. I think it's critical. And I also think that we need to make all of Obama's abuses of power issues in these Senate campaigns. Make every Senate Democrat who voted not to stand up to the EPA and not to stand up to the NLRB, who voted to let the FCC regulate the internet, who's going to vote to let the IRS make up its own taxes, make them explain that out on the campaign trail. Make them explain on the stump why anyone would re-elect someone to be a legislator who isn't up to the job of legislating, who just wants to let the president do whatever he wants to do. I think that's impossible to explain. And so I think that if we do that, then whatever happens in the presidential, we can finally force legislators to take responsibility for doing the job that they're supposed to do, not just looking the other way and letting the bureaucrats and the regulators have all the power. And so this is an extraordinarily frightening time in our history. The challenges are great, but I believe we can rise to them, and I believe that in this danger is an enormous opportunity to continue to engage more people, bring them into our movement. I take heart in gatherings like this one and the amazing growth that John was telling me about you've had over the past couple of years, and I know that with your help, we will win these fights and we will take back this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Phil Kerpen.